England, from a very early stage, and this is the work of the Cambridge School of family historians, seems to have had a structure of more or less a modern-style nuclear family. Very, very small, relatively atomistic families. And of course, law itself becomes of fundamental importance in mediating between them. So what I'm suggesting is, which is obvious to everybody, that law and history and the people and consent are very, very closely related with each other. But ladies and gentlemen, it's not simply that I happen to have fallen off a plane this morning. It's not simply that we're here this evening talking about Protimos. We mustn't forget there's a little thing called a general election happening. It's very good of you all to turn out. And ladies and gentlemen, that general election, even seen from the distance of America over the last 10 days, is a very, very peculiar one. And what it is, I think, it's the first general election at which it's become evident to all sorts of people that something is radically and seriously wrong with our political culture. Not only with our political culture, but I would argue with all our institutions of state. When I was a boy, it's a very, very long time ago, it was a source of pride. We thought of the English Parliament as the mother of parliaments. We thought of English law and English justice, we use that word, justice, as the best justice. We saw still the remains, if you like, of the great achievements of the Industrial Revolution. We had somehow the feeling of the English monarchy being a model, just as the Westminster Parliament was. I would suggest that all of that confidence is gone. We no longer think of English law, my lord, as the best. We no longer think of English justice as a model. We no longer think of the Westminster Parliament holding out our hand like a nursing mother to those lesser breeds without the law. What has happened? What has gone wrong? How might we begin to put it right? Because I do think, and I'm adopting sort of slightly false solemn term. I was introduced as a wit. I decided, like all clowns, to reveal the tragedy behind the mask. But it does seem to me that if we don't recognize that something has gone wrong, we have no chance of putting it right. That is, I think, the most important point that I want to make. And I think, again, as Lord Law said, history is not simply something dead. It is something, providing it's not taught at GCSE in the fashion in which it is taught at GCSE, which is fecund, fertile, can refresh, can make you think again. The very best accounts of history, of course, are those of novelists. You mentioned the novel. The idea of time as another country, a past world as another country where they do things differently, even occasionally do things as the same. But another country that forces a kind of tourism in time in which we should keep the open mind to be refreshed and to be rejuvenated, as ideally a holiday can. Time tourism. So let's begin right at the beginning. If we go back to the sort of very origins of English law in the 12th and 13th century, some very striking features emerge, and emerge very quickly. In the age of Henry II and Becket and Bracton, there is a very striking notion, and it's one I think that everybody in this room, and remember an organization, the Inns of Court, that don't go back quite so far, but go back right deeply into our medieval roots. Already, by the very origins of English law, the beginning of written English law, the beginning, unless we imagine the laws of Edward the Confessor actually exist, the very beginning of English law, written law, there was already the sense that English law was three things. It was coherent, it was different, and within England, it was universal. Now, this is very remarkable. England, of course, was an important monarchy. Along with France, it was one of the only two monarchies of the Middle Ages in which the full ritual of coronation, and the French, of course, have a much better word for coronation than we do, sacre, consecration of a monarch with holy oils. It was one of the only two monarchies that had this full grand ritual. It was one of the reasons, of course, that William the Conqueror, a mere duke, was so keen to get his hands on England. But England was not hugely important in the European context, nothing like, say, the German Empire. And yet, at this very early stage, England and English lawyers see themselves as an equivalent, equipolant, and rival system of law to Rome. This is the most remarkable thing about it. They consciously measure themselves against the achievements of Roman law and say that what we have done is produce something that is at least as good. Now, I think we've forgotten that, and I think it's time that we remembered it. And it's a very impressive thought, and it's a thought that suggests something very significant about our history. And again, one of the great problems is that you were talking about lawyers not always remembering their history. One of the great problems is historians increasingly have forgotten law, and on the whole devote very little time to it, either as political historians or more particularly as social historians, despite the overwhelming importance of legal evidence. Now, this sense of distinctness, this sense that English law can stand as an equal and rival to Roman, I think raises some very interesting questions. Because what I would like to suggest, and it's an enormous, daring and probably rather silly generalization, but I do think that Roman and English law reflect two absolute fundamental distinctions in the way in which human organizations operate. It seems to me that there are really two different ways of doing things. One is the English, and one is the Roman, and all its derivatives. And it also corresponds very much to a logical position. Roman law is essentially deductive. It deduces from grand general principles. English law does, of course, know maxims, but essentially English law is inductive. It takes specific cases and builds up. Now, this seems to me to be perfectly clear from the very beginning, and it remains profoundly important. Now, this also has very fundamental consequences, I think, for notions of state formation as well. If you like, a deductive state, the characteristic Roman state, which, can I gently say, is still very much with us. France and the European Union are consciously constructed on a Roman model. In France, what happens, of course, is that you have really 3 bites of the cherry that produce this radically different set of things. France seems to me, and England is a very nice remark, and you couldn't remember what Walter Scott actually said. I can't remember who said it, but the nice remark is that England and France are the missing halves of a perfect civilization, and if you could actually unite them. But as you know, the Channel is by far the widest strip of water in the world, and it's rather like Alice in Wonderland. You reverse as you go across. Now, the French have 3 great moments of state formation. Colbert, which are also legal. Colbert, in the reign of Louis XIV, the great minister, Napoleon and the Code Napoleon, and also the Fifth Republic. And they all do exactly the same thing. They create a state in which a parliament or a representative assembly or representative assemblies are seen as essentially consultative. They reflect the doings of little people that the intelligent ruler must take account of, but shouldn't pay too much attention to. On the other hand, power rests with an elite, which is an expert, trained elite. Its latest manifestation is the ENAC. And of course, when the French refer to a bureaucracy, they do not mean what we mean by a civil service. That is to say, a group of experts ordered to do what they do, in theory at any rate, by politicians. They mean what the word bureaucracy literally means, which is a ruling class, a ruling elite.